So the next speaker, I'm sure some of you have heard of. His name is Andreas. He has literally written the book on Bitcoin. Anyone heard of him? Yeah! There we go, excellent. Okay, so I'll hand over to him without too much further ado. But yes, please welcome Andreas Antonopoulos.
Hey everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for packing this room, and I'm really excited. This is my first time in Melbourne, and since I have a long mic like this, I'm going to try some comedy because it really feels like it's stand-up comedy, right? So I heard the most secure solution for Bitcoin was cold storage, and so I went down to Antarctica to use the ATM there. Okay, maybe I should go back to talking about Bitcoin. So it's been fun. I've only been in Melbourne for 2 days, and it's been rather interesting because my experience in Australia so far has been an experience of frustration with the traditional payment industry. And it's been quite bizarre because, you know, when you live in America, you get into this mind frame that America is the land where everything is perfect. And so we have the best technology, which, of course, if you travel at all, you know is not true. And if you travel, what you discover very quickly is that, in fact, in many ways, in America, things do not progress as fast as they do in other places. And I felt that very strongly when I travel abroad with my Visa card. So I have an American credit card. And American credit cards don't have chips in them. Nope, no chips. No RFID, no smart card chips, no chip and pin, none of that stuff. It's just a plain chunk of plastic. And when I've traveled abroad, Canada, and recently here in Australia, it's really funny because I'll give my card, and they'll take it, and they'll wave it over the machine. I'm like, that's so cool, but it's not going to work. No, you have to swipe it, and then I sign, and then you send a telegram to the bank, and they put the money on a steamship, and they send it across. You know, it's 1800s technology. It's really, really cool. And so our card technology is 10 years in the past. This really is interesting because credit cards as a whole are 1950s technology. I don't know if you realize that, but the first credit card was, I believe, the Diners Club, right? And at the time, it was essentially a form of traveler's checks, just in plastic. And they had a member number, a 4-digit member number. They weren't very optimistic. And you could have a plastic card that said Diners Club on it, and it had a 4-digit number, and then you could go places and you could say, "Do you take Diners Club?" And people would say no. Because, of course, nobody took it. and it took quite a while before these things became popular because what do you think people's reaction to that was? Well, that's not real money. That's not real money. What are you doing with this plastic card that you're waving around? I don't understand. We take cash here. Cash, real money. Which is interesting because when cash was first introduced in paper form, people said, that's not real money. We take silver here, like real metal. And I bet at some point somebody said, well, that's not real money. We take feathers here. So money has context, right? It has historical context, and it depends on the time you live in. Like, for example, here in 2014, or in the States, where we live in 1980 in terms of payment technology. The payment you use has that context. Well, here's the interesting thing. The people who are in this room today, we're about a decade ahead of everybody else. No doubt about it. So the people here are now experiencing payment technology as it's going to be in a decade from now. And I know this feeling because I felt it a few times in my life before. I've been involved in technology. If you haven't noticed, I'm a geek. I get excited about this stuff. I've been involved in technology since I was 10 years old. I got my first computer at 10 years old. Blew my mind. I spent months learning how to program. And I had this feeling that this is going to be really important. This is going to change the world. And then I got my first modem in 1986. It was the size of a shoebox. And it cost, if I remember correctly, about $600 at the time to buy a modem. And it did a blistering 300 bits per second. Amazing stuff. So you could sit there and download the text message one character at a time as it scrolled across the screen. And I thought it was the most amazing thing possible because I thought, you know, now I can communicate. I would literally dial up overseas numbers and dial into bulletin board systems in Los Angeles and talk to Americans. Little kid in Greece with my dial-up modem. You know, the first bill was hard. My parents were not happy about that. And so, you know, that to me was a glimpse of the future. And I had this vision that people will be able to connect and communicate with other people using these modems. And so I told everybody around me, this amazing thing is happening. I had this epiphany, a technological epiphany. I told everybody around me, modems are going to be amazing. Like, everyone's going to have one, and they're all going to communicate with each other by sending messages through modems. And everybody said, that's ridiculous. Go do your homework, because I was 16. So that didn't work very well. And so then I connected to the internet. And the way I connected to the internet is kind of quirky because I actually found a way to dial up into the mainframe of a university computer where they had accounts without secure passwords. And they just connected an internet connection to a system that had accounts for every member of faculty. So this mainframe, they just automatically created accounts. So of course there was an account for the archaeology professor who didn't know there was a mainframe. And so we used his account. And I got on the internet. Now, this to us today doesn't sound incredible, but this is 1989. And I'm 17 and a half. 17, going on 18 years old. Which, getting on the internet when you're 17, in 1989, when there's no one on the internet, is just an academic network, and getting to talk to other people over Usenet news groups, and then eventually sending emails with UUCP store and forward. And so I could tell my friends, you know, this email thing, it's amazing. It's really simple. All you have to do is launch SendMail, create a subdirectory where you create your mailbox. Then you start up this mail command, and then you type these commands in sequence into the terminal. You open either Emacs or Vi, and then you use Vi or Emacs, the visual editor, in order to edit. And then you hit send, and then 3 days later, it arrives on the other end of the world. Now, if you asked me then, will my mother ever use email? I would have said no. There's no way in hell anybody in the mainstream is going to use this technology, but my vision at the time was, this is the greatest thing ever. One day, we'll all be sending emails. And the people around me to whom I said this said, oh, stop it, Andreas, go do your homework. You see a recurring theme here. And I found myself going through these technology epiphanies. I saw my first website it was probably late 1991, early 1992, I believe. At the time using NCSA Mosaic to connect to one of the two websites that existed at the time, Bob Beranek and Newman, BBN website in the States. About a dozen students huddled over a workstation watching this thing spin until it popped up one page with text, and it had a photo in the middle of the text. I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. One day, people will go shopping using this system. And people said, oh, stop it, Andreas, go do your homework. Only this time, at least I was in computer science, so I actually enjoyed doing my homework. But anyway, so these are a series of epiphanies, technology epiphanies, every time that have just captured my imagination. I had one more with Linux. And then things dried up for a while until Bitcoin. And in 2011, I discovered Bitcoin for the first time. And my initial reaction to Bitcoin was, nerd money. Nobody's ever going to use that. And so I ignored it for another 6 months, and then I heard about it again, and I went out and I read the white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto. And when I read that white paper, it blew my mind. I saw this and I said, okay, this isn't a currency. It's a network. It's a distributed system. It's a trust model. It's a decentralized ledger of ownership. Holy shit, you can do incredible things with this. And so I've now spent the last 3 years going to everyone I know, this stuff is amazing. It's the most incredible thing since the last incredible thing I told you about several years ago when you told me to go do my homework. And you know, still people look at me and they look at me funny, right? Because I keep getting excited over these really geeky and esoteric things, and I think they're going to change the world. Well, I'll just point out my track record so far. The personal computer, the modem, the internet, websites, and Linux. That's 5 out of 5. So when I say Bitcoin is going to be amazing, pay attention. I might be right this time too. What is it about these 6 technologies? What is it about these 6 technologies that caught my imagination? What is the common theme that connects the personal computer, the modem, the internet, the website, Linux, and Bitcoin? Decentralization. A system that empowers end users and is not controlled by a central authority. A system that allows anyone to play around with technology and innovate. All of these systems had that same characteristic. They opened up for me, as a young kid, a world of opportunity far beyond what I could access in my life, far beyond my station in life, far beyond my surroundings. So if you're a kid living in Greece in a middle-class family in 1989, you know, the internet is just amazing, right? So Bitcoin now brings that possibility, and it attaches it to one of the most important powers we have in society, money, which is arguably one of the oldest technologies in the world. Money hasn't just existed since coins were printed. Money has existed in some form or another since human beings started using language. And the reason for that is because money is language. Money has existed in various forms, not for thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands of years, potentially millions of years. And so I like to think that the first wheel was sold for money. It may have been feathers, may have been beads, it may have been a line on a stick or a knot on a piece of rope. We've seen all of those things, in fact, be used as money. Because money happens as a cultural connection between people. It's a language that people use to express value to each other. And the fascinating thing is that money happens even when there's no medium to attach money. So if you've ever interacted with kindergartners, what you'll notice is that they start creating money of their own. And they'll start trading things. They'll amass cubes and trade those. I'll give you one of my lettered cubes if you give me one of your little cars, or maybe you can have 2 cubes for 1 car. And people do this spontaneously. In fact, it's not just people who do this. Scientists have seen this type of behavior in many different primate species. Very effectively in chimpanzees and orangutans. And in fact, they can very quickly teach money to primates. And guess what happens when you teach money to primates? Yep. They first figure out you can buy a banana, and then they figure out they can sell sex for it in exchange for bananas. And so even when you teach them that a simple token represents something of value and they start trading these tokens for bananas, very, very quickly they start trading them for other things too. But money is a form of expression, and it happens in primates, it happens in human beings. And at some point in our history, we took that form of expression and we created a monopoly that said that only sovereigns could create money. And this, you understand, was for our own good, as most government actions are. And unfortunately, the problem is that the power of money is an immense power, and when sovereigns took over the power of money, they used that. And they used it primarily to distort market forces and to very, very slowly and discreetly steal money from their population. And I'm not talking about taxes, although some people in this audience would probably call taxes a form of theft too. But I'm talking about inflation. So if you, people generally don't understand how inflation works. If they did, they'd be horrified, because then they would realize that they're being robbed on a daily basis. I think it was Ford who said that if the common people ever understand how central banking works, there'll be a revolution. He was probably right. Most people really don't understand how money works. The idea that an organization, in the US it's even more bizarre, the Federal Reserve Bank is not a government body. Who knew that? Did you know that? It's a private company. It's a private company made up of member banks. And they create money out of nothing, and then they use that money to buy treasury bills and put the government into debt against the money that they give their own member banks. Now, if you try to explain this to a 5-year-old, they will very quickly point out that if you give someone the ability to make money, they're going to rob you blind, because a 5-year-old will get that, right? You have to be an adult to miss that point. You have to be a very, very serious adult who says, no, the Federal Reserve Bank offers stability for our currency by carefully manipulating interest exchange rates on overnight banking loans between banks, thereby establishing a smooth business cycle between boom and bust, and allowing for the allocation of capital efficiently in the markets, which is all a very long way of saying they're robbing you blind. Now, if you then try to explain to the average person what 2% inflation is, there's two ways to explain it. You can say, well, 2% inflation means that every year your money reduces in actual purchasing value by 2%. And they'll try to do the math in their head, and if they're like me, they'll fail. They'll pull out a calculator and try to do it again, probably fail again, because compound interest is kind of tricky like that. Or there's a simple way to do it. In 36 years, everything is twice as expensive. What? You mean I save for 36 years, and then I've got $100,000 in the bank, but it's only worth 50 in today's money? Those guys are robbing us blind. But most people really don't think about money. Money is something that pervades our life, but most people don't think about it because we don't really understand it. And I challenge you to try to explain money to a 5-year-old. And you will very quickly find out that they start asking questions to which you don't have the answers. Most people don't have the answers to these questions. And the reason they don't have the answers to these questions is because most people don't understand money. Money, while it is used by all of us, is something almost mystical in nature. Why does a piece of cotton that is, well, let's say it's 60% cotton, 20% bacteria, and 20% cocaine, to be more accurate. A piece of cotton printed with green ink, why does that have value? And you have that discussion with people around you and see what they answer. Some people are going to give you this line. Well, you see, for every dollar out there in circulation, there's a certain amount of gold in the vault at Fort Knox. I have news for you. There is no gold. Right? That system of money was abolished in the Bretton Woods Treaty in 1936 or 33? 46. So that system doesn't exist. Why does a piece of paper, or in your case, a piece of indestructible plastic with a transparent window in it, very fucking cool, why does a piece of plastic like that have value? Because men with guns say it does. Well, I haven't met any of those men, and they haven't pointed any guns at me. And yet I still believe it has value. Why does it have value? And we really struggle to answer this question. And if a 5-year-old asks you, well, why is this valuable, and why can't I just have more? And can we just give everyone more so that everyone's happier? Then you have to start talking about inflation, and you end up right back where you started. The reason money has value is because other people accept that it has value. That's really the basis of it. Value in money is an illusion. It's a shared hallucination. We are all sharing the hallucination that these pieces of plastic have value. They don't have value, right? We assign value to them because we are willing to exchange them for products and services under the assumption that 2 days from now, when we go to exchange them again for products and services, people will actually give us products and services. And as long as that's true, it's money. Does that make sense? Yeah. So people tell me all day long that Bitcoin isn't really money. For a variety of reasons. It's not money because it has no central bank assigning it value. Well, no central bank really assigns value to any money, but okay. It's not money because it's not recognized by government, because it's not legal tender, because I can't use it at my local grocery store. Well, guess what? I can use it to buy products and services. In fact, I've been living off Bitcoin now for just over a year and a half. Almost all of my income is in Bitcoin. And some of my expenses are in Bitcoin, many of them are in dollars. And one of the reasons I know Bitcoin is money is because I give it to other people and they give me dollars for it. And that's a pretty good deal. There's another interesting thing that happens when you have this discussion, which people say, well, yeah, but you can buy drugs with Bitcoin. I believe the American expression is, no shit, Sherlock. It works here? Good. Of course you can buy drugs with Bitcoin. Here's the opposite question. Show me one currency you can't buy drugs with, and I'll show you something that isn't a currency. Drugs are the second most traded commodity in the world after food. Right? Depends on your definition. Recreational narcotics, I count caffeine and beer too. The fact that caffeine was illegal for 400 years and banned by the authorities in the Netherlands because it would drive the young people insane and create a horrible addiction which gave you the shakes and headaches if you tried to break it. And so they banned it under penalty of death for almost 400 years. Caffeine. Try to take my caffeine away, I am going to have the shakes. Drugs are the second most traded commodity in the world, and if you couldn't buy them with Bitcoin, arguably Bitcoin wouldn't be money. And I don't think that's a really relevant or interesting discussion. But the media focuses on the negative story. What if bad people get hold of Bitcoin? What if people use Bitcoin to buy drugs? And I find these questions really interesting because the truth of it, in fact, is that the vast majority of drugs in the world continue to be bought in US dollars. In fact, if you look at the life cycle of popular drugs, even if you manage to buy them with Bitcoin, those drugs were cultivated, planted, harvested, processed, reprocessed, cut, transported, smuggled, transported, cut again, distributed, and finally sold for US dollars. In fact, most likely someone rolled up the US dollar, put it in their nose, and snorted those drugs straight up their nose, leaving a residue of the drugs on the US dollar. Now, as far as I know, you can't do any of those things, including the rolling up of the Bitcoin to put in your nose to snort the drugs with Bitcoin. In fact, in order to buy drugs with Bitcoin, you would have to first get dollars, find someone who will sell you Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, find someone who will sell you drugs for Bitcoin, give them Bitcoin, get drugs, and then they sell the Bitcoin for dollars so they can pay their supplier. That sounds like a really complicated way. No, listen, real criminals use HSBC Bank. No, I'm sorry. I misspoke. What I meant was real criminals own HSBC Bank. HSBC Bank in Wachovia got caught laundering $700 billion over an 8-year period over the US-Mexico border to funnel money into the Sinaloa cartel. That resulted in an estimated 19,000 dead people. They got so good at it that at some point the local branch had the teller windows made to the specific size of a suitcase that was popularly sold in the local area, so that people could put suitcases full of cash straight through the teller window to increase the flow. Their biggest problem was the fact that they had to carry dozens of these suitcases with wheelbarrows into the local branch to shove them through the teller window. And this way they smuggled $700 billion directly into the hands of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, of course, you know what happens when you do something like that, right? Nothing at all, right? They got fined. In fact, they got fined less than $150 million, which was less than the profit they made on these transactions. Not a single person went to jail. 19,000 violations of the Anti-Money Laundering Act were completely ignored by the authorities. So, what is the truth here? The truth is that criminals use banks, and in many cases, criminals own banks. Because in the judicial system, the way it works, you have classes of crime. If you steal less than $1 million, it's a minor theft, probably a misdemeanor. If you steal more than $1 million, you start getting into serious trouble. But if you steal more than $1 billion, you get a bailout from the US government. The bottom line is that Bitcoin isn't about drugs and Bitcoin isn't about criminals. And the reason for that is because criminals and drug addicts make a vanishingly small percentage of the population, and Bitcoin has already started going mainstream. And as a technology goes mainstream, it adopts the values and principles of a mainstream audience. And a mainstream audience uses Bitcoin today for a #1 cause, charitable donations, tipping, and giving, right? That's what Bitcoin is being used today. I can make a prediction that in a few years, one of the primary uses for Bitcoin will be foreign remittances. Here's another market where banks are profiting in the most disgusting way possible. Every year, immigrants working in countries other than their own send home more than $550 billion in a market called foreign remittances. They send home back to their families, and the average immigrant supports more than 12 people back home, usually an entire community. Most of that money goes into the hands of women who use that money to invest in sanitation, healthcare, and education in their local communities. And this is the market that organizations like Western Union have decided is a great place to make profit. And they make profit to the tune of $175 billion a year by charging the poorest people on the planet 10% or more to send money home. It's an absolute shame. And here's the great news. We can fix that with Bitcoin within the next couple of years. We can set up networks that allow immigrants to use Bitcoin, sometimes without even knowing they're using Bitcoin, to convert local currency into Bitcoin, transmit the Bitcoin across borders, and convert it back into a local currency with a total cost less than 1%. That's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude reduction in fees. That's taking $175 billion and giving more than $100 billion back to the people who earned it, who can then spend it in the country they work in, or they can send it home so that their wife can spend it in sanitation, healthcare, and education in the local community. That can change the life of 2 billion people. So remember, remember why we're doing this. This isn't about buying drugs on the Silk Road. This isn't about enabling criminal activity. Because I look around this room and I don't see too many people who are interested in criminal activity. I see people with hope and aspiration, people who are interested in innovation, and people who are interested in bringing fairness back to currency markets. And we have within our power to fundamentally disrupt some of the most entrenched and anti-competitive industries that exist in the world. Banking hasn't seen any competition for the last 50 years, and that's not an accident. People don't start banks out of their garage and then take the mainstream and fight the main banks. Other than PayPal, nobody else has been able to do it, and PayPal very, very quickly got turned into a traditional bank, so they wouldn't disrupt too much. Well, something interesting just happened. Satoshi Nakamoto invented a method where we can apply innovation to financial services without asking for anyone's permission. Innovation without permission is the power that fuels the internet. It is the mechanism by which a kid in their garage can invent the next big app and take it global without asking anybody's permission. And we've done this again and again on the internet. In fact, a lot of us, especially people who are involved with libertarian ideals or are constantly fighting for freedom and things like that, often feel dejected and despairing and disappointed and disillusioned. After all, the internet is really one giant surveillance machine, and it's been captured by the man. And yet there are moments of optimism in that, and one of the greatest moments of optimism for me is that right in the middle of a completely captured, corporatized Apple, iTunes / Google / NSA internet, it gave birth to Bitcoin, a black swan of innovation that no one expected, and that will completely blow away several incumbent institutions and organizations, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it, because the power is in your hands. So when you despair, remember that the internet is still able to deliver massive surprise in the form of things like Bitcoin, and who knows what the next one will be, but I know that I'll be able to buy it for Bitcoin. And one of the most amazing things that's happening now is that Bitcoin has become the de facto currency of the internet. You see, one of the things about the internet that was always difficult since the very beginning was that while you could deliver incredible innovation, and while you could transport content and ideas and services across borders, when it came time to getting paid for that, things would slow down and everything became difficult. So I can be a brilliant entrepreneur in Bangalore, India, and I can invent the latest thing, and if I want to sell it, I have to get in bed with Visa or PayPal, and they're going to take away at least 3% of my money, and then they might freeze my account, and I'm only going to be able to sell it in 19 select countries around the world, and while my content can reach everywhere, the payments can't come back. Well, guess what? Now they can. Money on the internet is an incredibly potent combination. By turning money into a content type, we've made money instantaneously global, instantaneously secure, and now we're going to use that to fuel the internet all over again. We now have, with this new technology, the ability to fuel mesh networks, to fuel infrastructure development, to fuel content creators who can now use micropayments to get paid for the content that they create. We can fuel new applications. We can fuel the entrepreneurs of the future who can now do global IPOs, who can now source funds and loans on the internet directly from other people anywhere in the world using Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't something that just emerged from the internet. Bitcoin is going to turn around and now fuel the internet all over again. I often get asked, which country is going to adopt Bitcoin first? And I find that an amusing question, because it makes certain assumptions about borders and sovereignty and nation states, which is so 18th century. The most populous place on the earth is not China. The largest economy in the world is not the United States. The most populous place on the earth is the internet, and the largest economy in the world is the internet, and the internet now has a currency. Thank you. I'd like to close things with a simple slogan, because it sometimes help us remember what we're doing here. Until 2008, sovereignty created currency. After 2008, currency creates sovereignty. The internet currency is going to create internet sovereignty. It gives the people of the internet power, purchasing power, money power that they can use to establish independence and sovereignty. This is much bigger than just money. I'll take questions from the audience now, or also from Twitter in the back. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll use a similar format. Some people have already jumped in. We'll go one from the audience, one from there, back and forth. So, Mikey, I think you shot up first.
Hi, Andreas. I've loved your ideas about how Bitcoin crushes rent-seeking behaviours and those structural inefficiencies in the current global financial markets. Can you expand upon those and share them with this group?
That's a great question. So talking about how Bitcoin destroys rent-seeking behaviors, have you heard the expression rent-seeking? Who hasn't heard the expression rent-seeking? Okay, so rent-seeking behavior is defined by economics as a behavior where someone uses a position of incumbency or monopoly to extract profits without adding value to the supply chain. Right? So that's the economic definition. A rent-seeking behavior is when you are sitting on a fat flow of money and you get to stick a straw in it and suck as much of it out as you can just because of where you're sitting in the supply chain and not adding any value. It is the very definition of a parasite. What's happening across the world today is the absolute and total domination of parasite capitalism, of vampire capitalism. And this is not capitalism. This is not free market economics. What we have in the United States is a corporate socialist welfare program where the Fed gives free money to very large banking corporations so they can use it to game the system. That's not capitalism. Rent-seeking behavior is destructive because what it does is it destroys value without adding any value. And gradually, instead of that being, as it should be in most economies, simply a small part, an unavoidable part of the system. You know, every system has parasites. At some point, the parasite gets so big, it's bigger than the host. So imagine if I was walking around here and you all noticed that I had a tick on my back that was 190 pounds big. And I was really weak and shriveled up because it sucked out all my blood. That's the US economy. The tick is Goldman Sachs, just to give you that visual. But the point is, rent-seeking behavior happens because of centralization. Centralization allows companies to position themselves in a market in a position where they can take advantage of monopolistic behaviors or incumbency to extract value. And so to do that, you have to have centralization. If Goldman Sachs came to all of you and said, hey, can you give us 0.5% of all of your money? You'd say, who are you? Go away. No. But if they go to the Fed and take that directly from the money supply, then you don't get a choice. And so the point is that rent-seeking behavior is the kind of behavior that can only exist in a system that is heavily rigged. Bitcoin disrupts that in exactly the same way that the internet disrupted intermediaries in every single industry it touched. So when you take media and entertainment, for example, it used to be that the supply chain between an artist and their audience involved about 15 intermediaries who all took a small cut, right? Now, for many artists, the connection is direct. They bypass a lot of those intermediaries. Now, in many places, that's been replaced by one big one, which is Apple. Think again, big blood-sucking tick. And they extract a lot of the value, but the space for intermediaries has shrunk. And this has happened in almost every industry that the internet has touched. This is a nature of decentralized systems. By diffusing power. You see, the mistake is to think that you can somehow stop the accumulation of power by finding that one honest person, giving them all the power and hoping they act well. And that always fails. The only way to stop centralization of power is to diffuse power so that even though there will be bad actors, they don't have enough power to affect the entire system. And that's exactly what Bitcoin does. What it does is it takes the power of intermediary institutions and says, hey, Thank you so much for acting as a clearinghouse. We really appreciate your service over these many, many years, which you did, and toiled for the measly sum of 5 to 12% of our income. But we just replaced you with 100 lines of Python code, so thank you very much. We'll take it from here. And you don't need, and then you can start saying, well, I can do clearing of transactions for 1/3 of a penny. And why do we need you exactly? And so you cut out one intermediary. We could do this in the remittances market, for example, and say, so Western Union, what you do is you use other people's networks to move money from one country to another, and for that incredible service that only takes 5 to 7 days, you charge us 10%. Well, thank you very much for your service, but we just replaced your industry with 100 lines of Python code, so bye-bye now. And this is going to keep happening. We saw this in the internet. I remember in the early days on the internet, system administrators would go around with a T-shirt that said, I just replaced you with a script. And we can really do that now for financial services. The truth is that the vast majority of innovation that's happened in financial services over the last 20 years has been primarily in finding ways to cheat consumers and cheat markets. It's been about high-frequency trading, algo trading, sequencing transactions, front-running transactions, and extracting as much fees as possible from consumers. And consumers don't benefit from that. So when you give consumers an alternative and they begin to experience that, they start noticing things. People also ask me, how do we make Bitcoin successful? And it's like, you don't really need to market something that works. Bitcoin is useful. Just demonstrate it to people. And then they'll see that Bitcoin doesn't have banking hours, doesn't take 3 to 5 business days to clear, won't freeze your account, won't take a $35 fee if you don't have enough money. And by the way, Target just got compromised, 60 million accounts got stolen, Bitcoin doesn't give a shit. Right? Because we don't work that way. So these are the simple, usable, and useful characteristics of this currency, and those things once demonstrated to people. Now, we've got a long way to go to make it easy and secure and straightforward. Just like when I got on the internet and I had to go through all of that, I never expected my mom would send an email. By the way, exactly 20 years to the day after I sent my first email, my mother sent her first email on an iPad by swiping a finger across a screen. And it took 20 years to deliver that level of ease of use and functionality. But I have no doubt that she's going to use Bitcoin at some point, and it's going to be a lot easier, and it's not going to take us 20 years, because this time we have the internet. Okay. Let's take some more questions from someone else. Who else has got a question? Okay, from the board.
What are your thoughts on Ethereum and Bitcoin 2.0 protocols?
So how many of you here have heard of Bitcoin 2.0 and Ethereum? Okay, so within Bitcoin there is some functionality for scripting transactions. So you can define the recipient of the value of a transaction in terms of a script, and execution of that script defines whether you are allowed to spend the money or not. Now that functionality is limited in certain ways, primarily because of security questions. You've got to understand that within Bitcoin there are certain compromises or trade-offs between security and efficiency or ease of use or functionality. Sometimes when you're trying to build the first digital reserve currency, you want it to be robust rather than extremely flexible. I think that a lot of the things that we can do with smart contracts we can do with Bitcoin. But other people also see opportunities that Bitcoin can't possibly meet right now. Or they're looking for ways to increase the pace of development and innovation at a pace that Bitcoin simply can't follow. The truth of the matter is that Bitcoin as a protocol is a production level network with more than $5 billion worth of value riding on it right now. Making code changes to Bitcoin is a bit like doing maintenance on your Jumbo 747 while in mid-flight. You want to make sure you don't drop a nut or a bolt or something, or turn the engine off accidentally while you're doing that. And we have seen occasions where things have happened in Bitcoin because of code changes. So the current development rate in Bitcoin is purposefully slow. It's very conservative for good reasons. It's got a lot of value riding on it. And some people think they can do something much more flexible. So Ethereum is a system that enables full Turing-complete programmable contracts to be executed on a blockchain-like technology. It's Not launched yet other than in alpha. I've used Ethereum in alpha. I've written Ethereum scripts. You can use a language that's very similar to Python. It's called Serpent. And it allows you to script contracts and transactions of immense complexity. You can implement alt currencies in just a few lines. You can implement Namecoin in just a few lines. You can create decentralized marketplaces and exchanges, escrow accounts, multi-level escrow accounts, and even a system called a decentralized autonomous corporation, or DAC. And a decentralized autonomous corporation is essentially a corporate engine that runs as an automaton, where the shareholders control that system only through the code that it's running. So essentially, you've got corporate governance expressed as code, and the corporation acts independently of the shareholders. It's a really interesting concept, and you can do some amazing things with that. For example, one of the ideas I had was for a decentralized, autonomous, altruistic corporation, or if you like, an automated charity. You could have, for example, a charity that accepts donations and then monitors social media for disasters. And when it sees a specific volume of requests for charitable funds for a massive disaster from enough different sources, it directs some of its charitable funds and builds an endowment completely independently of humans. Maybe a completely crazy idea. Who knows? Someone out there is going to try and write it pretty soon. So yes, I'm really excited about Bitcoin 2.0. Do you want to just pick from the top? Okay, one from the audience again. Who's got a question in the audience? Yes. I think I saw that up there too. Do sidechains have the capacity to dilute the network effect of the blockchain? Sidechains are a technology that allow you to seamlessly move value from Bitcoin's blockchain to another blockchain without creating an altcoin. And what they do is they allow you to leverage features in alternative chains, such as, for example, creating an alternative blockchain that is focused on microtransactions and very quick settlement, or an alternative blockchain that supports a different scripting language like Ethereum, or any other type of alternative blockchain without having to either mine that or necessarily create an alt currency around it. I think sidechains actually boost the network effect of Bitcoin. Effectively, what you're doing there is you're using Bitcoin as a reserve currency, and you're saying that the Bitcoin will act as the value that backs this other currency by burying that value temporarily and exposing it to the other chain and then bringing it back into the future. You put up Bitcoin as collateral and leverage it in the other chain as an alternative currency, essentially. That concept only makes Bitcoin more valuable because it turns it into a reserve currency. And I think it's going to accelerate the rate of innovation around altchains and alternative applications of the blockchain. We've seen nothing yet. This is one other thing that I just find so damn amusing. I go to government organizations and I have discussions about them, and they're like, oh no, what are we going to do about Bitcoin? And what they're talking about is Bitcoin circa 2008. If only they knew how much we've done in the last 5 years. It's like, oh, you're scared of Bitcoin. Yeah, there's 500 other currencies. Some of them are really stealthy. They've evolved a bit like the species in Australia. Some of them have turned very, very venomous. So if you think that cuddly little currency, Bitcoin, in the corner is threatening, just wait until I explain to you how Darkcoin works. Right? And that's just the beginning, because there's also a lot of other innovations and developments that have nothing to do with regulation. But the point is that they are failing to grasp Bitcoin as it was in 2008. And we've got 5 years of development in all kinds of amazing technologies. This is one of the most exciting spaces to work in as a computer scientist and as an entrepreneur, because the pace of innovation is just staggeringly fast. All right, let's take another question from the board. All right. Cody Wilson running for a position on the Bitcoin Foundation. Any thoughts? That's just delicious. Does anybody here not know who Cody Wilson is? Okay. So Cody Wilson came to fame when he built a system called the Liberator, which was a 3D printed gun where you could download the schematics, and using a MakerBot, you could print a gun that could actually fire bullets. Now, you can only fire once or twice before it blew apart, but the idea that you could download a gun on the internet, that caused, how do I put this? a slight modicum of controversy in the United States and outright panic in most other countries. There's always a group in the United States who are like, oh yeah, awesome, my 12-year-old can now print his own gun. And all of the rational people went off screaming. So Cody Wilson did that. He recently built a CNC machine. He's just a shit stirrer. I love this. He built a CNC machine. CNC machine is a computer-aided mill, right? So it basically, instead of additive manufacturing where you print layers of plastic, it cuts away from a block of metal and reveals the shape within. So he built a CNC machine which takes a standard size block of aluminum or steel or something like that, and it has one button, you press a button, and it converts that block into the lower receiver of an AR-15 assault rifle. The lower receiver is the only part of the gun that's actually registered and regulated in the United States. You can buy all of the rest of the stuff. You can buy a barrel, you can go into Walmart and buy that stuff from a catalog and have it shipped anywhere in the United States in 1 to 3 days, and get loyalty points for it. And so you can print that and essentially have the only part of a gun that's regulated without a serial number, and then assemble all of the other components around it, and now you have an assault rifle that you printed in your kitchen. So that's who Cody Wilson is. He's also behind Dark Wallet and Dark Market, and many other very, very disruptive innovations. He is a shit stirrer of epic proportions. And he thinks the Bitcoin Foundation is a den of thieves and corruption, and he wants to be elected so he can destroy it. That is his actual platform for the upcoming Bitcoin Foundation elections. Elect me, and I'll blow this shit up. And so, yeah, I don't know what to comment about that. I mean, I just think it's democracy, awesome. If anybody here is still a Bitcoin Foundation member, I resigned several months ago. If anybody here is still a member, vote, and let's see what happens. It's going to be just amazing to watch. All right, any questions from the audience? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on security questions that people ask in light of things like Mt. Gox and a lot of people are hesitant to move forward because they fear the security of the currency?
Yeah, security and Bitcoin. It's a very interesting topic. I think one of the interesting things that's happened is that Bitcoin itself has led to a massive acceleration of security research and the development of better privacy and encryption controls. The innovation that has happened on key management, key generation, multi-signature keys and things like that is faster than has ever happened in the history of security before. I mean, PGP has been around for 25 years and doesn't have multi-sig. And Bitcoin had multi-sig as a 3-year-old. So there's an amazing amount of innovation happening here. Every problem you see in Bitcoin, in my opinion, is a multi-billion-dollar industry waiting to happen. So I use this analogy often. You know, in 1994, if you read the media stories about the internet, everybody said, well, it's going to fail because nobody can find anything. Well, look at what happened to the two dudes who figured out how to solve that problem. Yeah, $360 billion company later that didn't exist at all in 1994, Google, and so many other companies developing search. It's too difficult to use. Well, then browser companies happened, et cetera, and Apple largely has made a lot of money out of making things easier to use. Security is something that we're going to need to learn how to do on a much different level. This is the first time ever that you've had actual money sitting on a general purpose computing device. And our general purpose computing devices were never designed to carry actual money. They're designed in some cases to carry proxies to money, credentials for a credit card, et cetera, et cetera. And even those are pretty dodgy if you have them on your personal computer. So the problem with this is that we have very, very little experience doing information security. What we're seeing now is the development of devices that allow us to do Bitcoin wallets very securely. Has anybody here heard of the Trezor? Yeah? So I have a few Trezors actually. I love this device. I use it. There's many others. I'm not endorsing the company. Don't take anything I say as an endorsement. But I use the device. Do you have one there to show people? Oh, fantastic. So that's a Trezor. It's a yeah. And again, sorry, this isn't an ad. I just want to explain to people how these things work. This is a USB device that does key generation and signing on board the device in a tamper-proof chip. We're going to see a lot of these types of devices, hardware wallets, come out. This exposes very little over USB, which makes it almost impossible to hack, and the keys always stay on this device. They never leave this device. So as a result, my computer doesn't need to store things securely because I carry one of these around, and I store my keys on there. Thank you. We're going to see a lot more innovation and development in that space, and gradually people are going to get more comfortable with the idea of using mobile wallets. I think Apple Pay is a fantastic development in that respect, because it gets people accustomed to the idea of having a mobile wallet and using it to make payments. And so once they're accustomed to that idea, we can say, hey, Bitcoin can do all of that, minus the banks and credit cards. And that's a pretty compelling proposition in my book. So I think you can demonstrate a much better value for Bitcoin. Security is going to be difficult. I would want to point out, however, you mentioned MTGOX. It's important to realize exactly what happened with MTGOX. MTGOX was a centralized system built on top of a decentralized currency where one person took control of all of the keys and had custodial access to all of the accounts and all of the money of all of the users. That's the oldest story in the world. I will find you quotes from the ancient Greeks 3,000 years ago explaining what happens when one person takes control of another person's money. They run away with it. We knew this 3,000 years ago. Nothing has changed. Pretty much all of the regulatory infrastructure in banking is designed to solve that one problem, that if you give another person control of your money, they run away with it. MTGOX was not a failure of Bitcoin. Nothing in Bitcoin failed. What failed was that people entrusted their money by giving control of the keys. Here's a simple rule. Have you heard the expression, possession is 9/10 of the law? In Bitcoin, possession is 10/10 of the law. There are no other tenths left. Do you control the keys to your money? Yes, it's your money. No, it's not your money. It's as simple as that. If you give control of your keys to someone else, it is no longer your money. It is a promise from the other person to maybe pay you back later.
That's a great segue to the question, which is about what your view is of how advertising will be transformed into digital currency when we can each get a share of that transaction around advertising and actually transform advertising from a push model to a pull model.
How will advertising be transformed by digital currency? I don't know. I mean, I think in many cases you're going to see a lot of innovation around micropayments for advertising. But I think the much more exciting possibility is this. There are currently only 2 business models on the internet. And this is because you don't have a payment system that is suitable for doing internet transactions. Credit cards are not really suitable for the internet era. It costs too much to process. The transaction has to be fairly large. Storing them is extremely cumbersome and very expensive to secure. So credit cards don't really work very well on the internet. And so as a result, there are 2 primary business models on the internet. If you can't tell what the product is, you're the product. That's business model number 1, also known as the Facebook model, right? It's free. All you have to do is give us all your private information so we can sell it to everybody else. That's the business model that dominates on the internet today, which is give up your privacy, sell us your private information, allow us to track your every breath and living moment, and we will monetize the shit out of your personality and give you nothing in return, other than a little button so you can poke people. I quit Facebook in 2010, can you tell? So that's one business model. So again, the simple rule of thumb is this. If you don't know what the product is, you're the product. Okay? And the second model is advertising, which is basically, thank you for coming to our site. Here are 15 things that you don't need, but you really, really should buy, because they're going to make you smarter, sexier, and most likely slimmer. Right? And then shove a lot of that down your eyeballs until you go half blind from the advertising. The best model is a hybrid of the 2, which is we try to figure out what you like and then shove lots of advertising down your eyeballs based on what we think you like. If you've ever try using incognito or private browsing mode to browse some of your favorite sites and look how different they look. And I'm not talking about shopping sites. Go browse the news with a browser that's hiding your cookies and notice how different the news is when you read it without your personal profile attached. You'll be amazed at what kind of news stories you get fed when they know who you are versus what kind of news stories you get fed when they have no idea who you are. So those are the two business models on the internet. And the reason these business models exist is because there's no simple way for content creators to get paid for the value of their content because it's too expensive to process transactions. Bitcoin solves that problem. And once it solves that problem, you now have the third model, which is I go online, and if I want stuff, I pay for it. Simpler, isn't it? No advertising, no selling my personal information. You don't even have my personal information. I simply pay for the stuff I want online. The content creator can get paid. They can make money by charging 5 pennies per read of an article, because now you can actually process a 5-penny transaction anywhere in the world from anybody's wallet online with a single click. I get the article I want to read, and I don't get sold sanitary products or, you know, flights to a Caribbean island or whatever else they're going to shove down my eyeballs this year. All right, so better than streamlining advertising, replace advertising with paying for the stuff you actually want to buy. Let's go back.
I think the bottom one technically has the most votes.
All right, who leaked? I'm considering doing a charity bungee jump. And I'm not promising anything, but I'm considering in Queenstown. I got to tell you, the idea terrifies me. I do not like the idea of voluntarily departing a nice, fixed, stable object into the void. But I'm thinking of doing it as a charity fundraiser. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it whereby the person who raises the most money gets to push me off the bridge. I think there might be some liability issues with that, although I am pretty sure with all of my Reddit haters, I would raise $1 million if they got to push me off a bridge. Yeah, instead, yeah, I'm going to check the ropes very carefully in case Goldman Sachs tied them. Instead, I might just do, hey, you know, if we raise enough money, I'll go jump. New Zealand's apparently the place to do it. So I'm not promising anything, but that's a possibility. Okay, let's see what else. Bitcoin doesn't have the same level of backing as PayPal and Apple Pay. Can Bitcoin go mainstream in that competitive environment? I think this is a really, this is a question I hear a lot of the time, which is, you know, when will the banks come and give Bitcoin legitimacy and capital so it can succeed? How do we make the banks give us legitimacy and capital so we can succeed? We don't need legitimacy, and we certainly don't need legitimacy from people who have made a mockery of the very word legitimacy. And we certainly don't need capital because guess what? We just created our own money. It's self-capitalizing. Many of the most exciting businesses I have seen on Bitcoin have been capitalized entirely in Bitcoin by early investors. Adoption is what drives this. Adoption happens when you tell 2 other people. We don't need backing. PayPal and Apple Pay will teach consumers the evil of banking again and again and again because they are stuck in a paradigm that they cannot escape. A paradigm of pull transactions and identity-laden transactions that lead to identity theft and fraud and frozen accounts and broken hearts. And they only work in 19 countries. And guess what? There's 6 billion people out there who have very little in banking. And do you think that bringing finance to the far corners of Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa is going to happen on the back of an iPhone with Visa as the sponsor? No, it's going to happen on a $20 Android with Bitcoin. And there's absolutely nothing that can stop that. We don't need backing. Do you think Bitcoin would see more traction and mainstream success if it was divorced from libertarian and neo-anarchist rants? So I'm not actually a libertarian. I'm a disruptarian. I believe in every now and then shaking things up a bit to see what comes out, because when things get too stable, they actually end up getting too concentrated. But politics aside, listen, Bitcoin represents the principles of the people using Bitcoin. And Bitcoin doesn't have to change its principles to go mainstream, but when it goes mainstream, it will change its principles. It will reflect the principles of an entirely different population. The Bitcoin of 2020 will not be the Bitcoin of today if Bitcoin is successful. I can give you some very useful predictions. First of all, the Bitcoin of 2020 will be in Mandarin. Hello, of course it will be in Mandarin, right? The average person on this planet is a 23-year-old Han Chinese male who speaks Mandarin. That is the average human of the planet. If Bitcoin becomes mainstream, it will represent the values of the average human on the planet. And if Bitcoin is adopted by Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia, it's no longer going to be the currency of educated computer science, geeky, neo-anarchist, neo-libertarians, or whatever the hell that label was. And I can give up my rants, because really the only reason I'm here ranting about banks is because banks suck, and it's not difficult to make that argument. But really, this isn't about politics. Bitcoin is a neutral currency. Here's another important point. I think most people need to hear this, even if it annoys some people. The truth is offensive when it is put in a context of lies. George Orwell said it best: at a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. When Galileo put two ground pieces of glass together with a tube and pointed them upwards, he created a revolution, an act of revolution in the context of the Roman Catholic Empire in medieval Europe. Was that because the two ground pieces of glass were a tool of revolution? They simply revealed the truth. And the reason they were revolutionary was because they were in a society that was in a context steeped with lies and tyranny. When you speak the simple truth that individuals controlling their money themselves, and that governments in the majority case, not perhaps in the United States, not in Australia, but there are 193 countries out there, and in many countries, governments and banks are indistinguishable from organized crime. And in those countries, people are better off if they control their own money. That is a simple truth. If that statement is revolutionary, it is only revolutionary because the context in which we live tells you that the truth is otherwise. And so you may think that's a neo-libertarian rant. I think that's simply telling the truth. And it's up to the person listening to make their own judgment. All right. When will Bitcoin reach 10,000? What is this symbol here? Is that the S word? My prediction for Bitcoin is that when Bitcoin achieves mainstream status, the value of Bitcoin will be exactly 1 Bitcoin, or 100 million Satoshis. The simple truth is that asking that question assumes that the vast majority of the economy that we care about is outside of Bitcoin. And I think the success for Bitcoin means that that is no longer the case. To ask the question, how much value in US dollars does Bitcoin have, assumes that the frame of reference is the US dollar, assumes that we want to convert US dollars to Bitcoin, assumes that we care about the economic activity that happens in that economy. That is the same as asking in 1994, how many fax machines will the internet replace? How many long-distance phone calls will it replace? What is the value of the internet if it dominates the long-distance phone call market? And that question makes no fucking sense. But that is exactly the question people were asking in the mid-90s, because to them that was the paradigm, that was the context. Communications meant that. And to create a new communications medium meant simply replacing the old medium with the new medium, like for like, in a one-to-one translation. You must realize that what we're doing here is not creating a better visa system so we can go shopping and expend fewer calories when we swipe our cards. That is not the point. And Bitcoin will not be the replacement of e-commerce transactions on Amazon.com with the same e-commerce transactions on Amazon.com in order to buy more plastic Chinese junk. That's not the point here. Bitcoin is not about shopping in the first world. It's about everything else everywhere else. Bitcoin succeeds when a farmer in Kenya can raise money and buy a loan, get a loan to buy seeds from 10,000 lenders all around the world that he has never met through a peer-to-peer lending system. That value was never in dollars. That value didn't exist until Bitcoin comes along and makes it possible for this thing to happen. Bitcoin is all about the things that are not possible with today's money. And that is an enormous economy, far bigger than the existing global economy, because the existing global economy leaves 5 to 6 billion people out of the picture. And so if you imagine Bitcoin as bringing a global transnational currency that is available to all of the people who are today underbanked and unbanked. And people tell me that's a crazy idea because it's never going to happen because we don't have the infrastructure, because it will take an enormous investment in infrastructure to happen. We know that's not true because we've already seen this happen with cell phones. Sub-Saharan Africa never got landlines. They just skipped that entire level of technology in a system called leapfrogging, and they jumped directly to cell phones. There are places on the Amazon River where the nearest bank branch is 100 miles downstream by canoe. Those people are not going to get banking because JP Morgan Chase opens a branch. Ever. But guess what? There's a cell phone tower in that village. And that village has a little solar panel, and that solar panel has a Nokia 1000 text messaging phone connected to it, because it's worth having that, and because it's easier to deploy cell phone tower infrastructure everywhere. And now, that Nokia 1000 is a banking terminal, and a Bloomberg terminal, and a Western Union terminal, and a loan origination terminal, and an IPO terminal, and a stock market, and a currency exchange, and a commodity market. And you can do all of those things over text messaging with Bitcoin. So I don't think it's insane to think that when people have this enormous need, if we provide the technology at a level of technology that can be adopted around the world, that this is going to happen. And I would urge you to look at where it has happened before. In Kenya in 2001, they introduced a system that allowed people to transmit cell phone minutes to each other. That system is called M-Pesa. And that system within a year or so became a currency, an informal currency that people started trading in lieu of money because they didn't have any other form of money. They could afford to buy a cell phone. They could afford to buy a plan with minutes because they needed that to communicate with the rest of the world, because that meant economic opportunity for them. So they invested in those things. And then you can imagine this environment where one day someone goes to a shop and says, well, I need some eggs to feed the kids, but I don't have any money. Can I give you 3 cell phone minutes for some eggs? And the shop owner says, sure, whatever, I can always use some more cell phone minutes. And they give some eggs, and a currency is born, just like that. Well, fast forward 12 years later, M-Pesa represents 40%, 40% of the GDP of Kenya. And that's not GDP that existed before and got converted into M-Pesa. This is brand new economic activity that didn't exist before. They did it. We can do this again with Bitcoin, and we can do it globally. So I don't think it's crazy to think about an economy that is built around Bitcoin that is far bigger than the traditional economy, because we can do this on the internet and with text messaging phones now. Are you worried about dams, distributed automated militaries? I don't know a single case in the history of humanity when someone was given the choice between healthcare and war and chose to fund war. So the only way you can fund war is by forcing people to pay you taxes and stealing from them. Very few people actually want war, so I'm not... distributed automated militaries are going to not be funded. I'm not buying any dams. Most exciting ideas with potential to take the blockchain protocol mainstream aren't currently implemented in Bitcoin. If blockchain protocol does succeed, will it be the Bitcoin blockchain? Yes. We've seen an enormous amount of innovation in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a static system. It's a highly dynamic system that is still undergoing change and innovation. And I think we misunderstand the ability of society to absorb change. You know, multi-sig technology has existed on Bitcoin for 2 years now, and only recently are people building the applications. The things you can do with simple multi-sig and time locks will blow your mind. The combinations of escrow and smart contracts you can build just with those simple building blocks of multi-signature and time locks is out of this world. We can automate some enormous amount of financial transactions with that. And we can already do that in Bitcoin today. Now, can you build a better widget with Ethereum or something else that can do even more complex contracts? Yes. But then you still have to explain multisig to everyone and get them to adopt that before they start doing the complex stuff. So I'm not worried. Bitcoin continues to evolve. What do you say to those who say Bitcoin ends up looking like the current banking system? I think that there may come a time when Bitcoin becomes too centralized. But the interesting thing is that we've opened the door and created a technology that can be replicated in infinite variation. I, for one, if I saw Bitcoin become too centralized, would sell my Bitcoin and buy a new coin that was more decentralized and continue doing this in a different form. But the most important thing to realize is that the absolute worst case scenario for Bitcoin is not as centralized as the current financial system. Anything we do with Bitcoin is monumentally disruptive and more decentralized than the current financial system. So if we open the door to that possibility, we let people understand they can take control over money, I think that's a win, no matter where Bitcoin goes. All right, does anybody else want to ask a question in the audience? I think we're running out of time, right? Okay, yes.
Do you ever speculate on which governments, which corporations are pro-neutral or anti-Bitcoin? I mean,
Yes, that's a really good question.
I'm very confused when I look at government tax rates for some Bitcoin, when I think, well, do they actually... Because governments obviously have a lot of power to slow down the adoption, even if they can't.
Do I ever think of which companies... governments, which corporations, which nations are pro or against Bitcoin? I think there's a really large amount of paranoia in this space, which, don't get me wrong, a lot of it is justified. But there's a lot of paranoia about the idea that governments are fighting this. And the truth is they're not. The truth is they're not. First of all, because governments don't get organized that well to figure out that this is a threat. As far as they're concerned, the idea of Bitcoin threatening the financial system or central banking is as laughable as a local lemonade stand threatening Walmart. It's like, go do your homework, Andreas. Which is great, because if they keep thinking that for 3 to 4 more years, yeah. So the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it is a fairly neutral system, right? It decentralizes control and access to money. If you think about it, in my opinion, and I said this at the Senate hearings in Canada, Bitcoin expresses the principles of enlightenment of the Renaissance, which are self-determination, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. Who doesn't like those principles? Well, there are some governments that don't like their principles. Right? There are some governments that do not like the idea of a citizenry that has control over their money, that can use that money to do self-determination, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. And that says very little about Bitcoin, but it says an awful lot about those governments. So when you look at government actions towards Bitcoin, use that as a lens to understand what those governments want for their constituents and their citizens. They either don't understand it, or when they do start to understanding it, if they fear Bitcoin, they fear their own citizens. They fear their own constituents. And that is not a good government. Bitcoin is a mirror. You put it up in the face of government and it shines right back at them, right? Mirror, mirror on the wall, which is the most oppressive government of them all? They started to shut down the internet, then they tried to shut down Twitter, now they're after Bitcoin. Ha! We can see you. The emperor has no clothes, right? You can actually make some pretty cogent determinations about a government's attitude towards freedom. Now, you see certain countries, the United States right now is taking a wait-and-see approach. Most liberal democracies are looking at Bitcoin, and if you whisper the right words in the ears of politicians, they get it. You know, the key words here are jobs, innovation, growth, votes, campaign finance contributions. So in the US, if you look at it, the first two regulations that came out, the first one was from FinCEN saying that it is legal and perfectly fine for individuals to use this, but you know, that large organizations, and the IRS came out with a ruling that you have to pay taxes on it, and large organizations that do exchanges need to report money laundering stuff to the government. And the second determination was from the Federal Election Commission that said that politicians could take campaign contributions in Bitcoin. Right? So what does that tell you? They look at it as like, oh, we can raise some money here, and we can make some money for our campaigns. And then some politicians figured out the third part of that equation, which is, and we look hip to the young people. Which is always amusing when you see someone who is so obviously not hip to try to be hip with the young people. I don't try, I know I'm not. But, so Bitcoin has an appeal to certain people, and most governments see it as an opportunity to inject some competition into the banking system, an opportunity to generate jobs domestically, to create a whole bunch of new startups and innovation centers, to make their banking system more flexible. I've talked to, for example, one of the main banks in Brazil, and their main question is, we have 80 million people throughout the Amazonian basin that we can't reach with branches. Can we use Bitcoin to extend services to them via SMS? Smart banks that want to serve consumers understand that this is a tool that they can use to cost effectively reach people they've never reached before. So very few governments and very few corporations are afraid of and or fighting Bitcoin, and they're doing that because they simply do not believe in the principles of enlightenment. Yes?
You said that you've earned your wages in Bitcoin for the last few years.
Yes.
Now, you also said that you pay taxes because you have to. But in Australia, you can't pay taxes in Bitcoin. We effectively get double tax once we buy Bitcoin, once we sell Bitcoin.
Right. So yeah, I pay my taxes in dollars, and in order to pay my taxes in dollars, I have to sell. In fact, by the way, we saw a pretty significant price dip just before the October 15th deadline, which was the extended deadline for the previous tax year in the US. And I think a lot of that was because a lot of people who are involved in Bitcoin like me sold a bunch of Bitcoin to pay their taxes. And yeah, so I have to sell my Bitcoin to pay taxes, and the whole GST mess that has been created by the Australian government is going to put a pretty big damper on Bitcoin activity. It's going to make it very difficult. You get double taxed when you do that. Monumentally stupid decision? Yeah, it is. And, but of course, it's not going to slow down Bitcoin. Bitcoin continues. It may slow down Bitcoin innovation in Australia, which would be a real shame. I haven't talked too much about the regulation aspect, but to me, Australia is perfectly positioned to be a hub of economic activity and innovation in Bitcoin for the whole of Southeast Asia, because of robust telecommunications, an English-speaking population that, you know, because of the origins of Bitcoin, can adopt and understand and read the documentation and adopt it much faster. You've got an innovation economy, you've got a tech sector, you've got a very large literate population with smartphones. This is the place where you can create a hub that spreads Bitcoin throughout Southeast Asia and really starts affecting places like Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and you know, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, which have a desperate need to fill the gap for the unbanked. So monumentally stupid decision to put a damper on Bitcoin in this country. Last question of the night. Yes?
What is your point of view about mining Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency?
What is my perspective on mining Bitcoins? All right, so here's something that may surprise you. I have never mined a single Bitcoin in my entire involvement in Bitcoin. By the time I got into Bitcoin, mining was already FPGA and GPU centric, and very quickly soon after became ASIC centric. I have no interest in speculating on hardware sales, on playing the extremely risky game of trying to predict delivery dates and mining difficulty and hashing difficulty. Mining is a highly specialized game. You have to do it at scale. You have to do it with specialized gear. That gear may not get delivered. By the time it gets delivered, it might not be profitable. You know, I've got enough risk for my appetite just getting paid in Bitcoin and trying to figure out how quickly I can convert it when I need to pay some of my bills. I don't need the extra stress, thank you. It's a big misunderstanding for people to think that in order to be in Bitcoin, you have to get into mining. Mining is a function of the network. Its goal is to secure transactions. It is not to deliver reward. Reward is a side effect. Reward is how you incent people to secure the transactions. And mining really doesn't need to scale as fast as transactions. If you want to invest in Bitcoin, first of all, if you want to get Bitcoin, let me give you the quick primer. The easiest way to get Bitcoin is to sell a product or service and charge people for it in Bitcoin. All of you here have a skill that you sell as a service, either to your employer or on the free market. You can sell that service for Bitcoin. If you have a progressive employer, go talk to them about paying part of your salary in Bitcoin. It can be done. Lots of companies do it nowadays. Or just convert some of your money in Bitcoin by buying it to an exchange. But the easiest way is to go online, start a little website, and start selling something for Bitcoin. You'd be amazed. One of my good friends at blockchain, George Mandrick, he's very well known in the Liberty movement. He used his oven to mine for Bitcoins. He baked baklava and shipped baklava worldwide for Bitcoin. He sold hundreds of trays of baklava for Bitcoin and made hundreds of Bitcoin at the time when the price of Bitcoin was pretty low. So he used his oven and his Greek cooking skills to bake for Bitcoin. It's really that simple. Take a product or service you can sell for Bitcoin and sell it. The second best way is to use an exchange to buy your Bitcoin, or simply use local Bitcoins or the Mycelium trading application or another decentralized trading application to find someone at a Starbucks. Or to find someone and use that to trade Bitcoins locally. And leave mining for people who really, really have a thing for hardware. There are geeks out there who just love building hardware rigs and they enjoy doing this. It's not something. Sorry? Proof of work in the mining function is the security mechanism behind the blockchain. But here's the magical trick. Most people don't realize this. Mining is completely independent of the volume or value of Bitcoin, the volume of transactions, meaning that the current amount of mining happening today is enough to secure the network even if we expand it to global adoption levels. Why? Because there are not enough computers in the world to do more than what the miners are doing, and therefore it is secure enough. At this point, we're done. The only reason people continue doing that is because it's still profitable. But that changes pretty soon. In 2016, the reward is halved. Mining is designed to reach a free market, perfect market equilibrium where the profit from the activity barely exceeds the cost. The revenue from the activity barely exceeds the cost, giving you a minuscule profit margin, just enough to keep you interested. And if you make too much money, other people come into the market, difficulty goes up. If you stop making money, you depart the market, difficulty goes down. And it's an equilibrium that actually maps to the price of electricity almost exactly. So mining doesn't need to scale any more than it has already to keep Bitcoin secure. And I predict that it's not going to continue on an exponential curve forever. I mean, that doesn't make much sense. That would not be, it's not necessary to continue using Bitcoin. It is necessary to have mining. It's not necessary to have more mining.
Yeah, but once, like, you're not going to be able to mine more Bitcoin, what would be the incentive of people to keep, sustaining?
All right, that's another interesting question. Once the Bitcoins run out, why would people continue to mine to secure the network? You've got to understand this is an extremely long time scale. The reward halving works in such a way that the final Bitcoin Satoshis are mined in 2140. Now in 2140, I'm assuming the Bitcoins will be mined by a Dyson sphere encircling a local star and harvesting the energy of the star. I mean, I'm not going to make predictions out to 2140, but the point being here that there's an equilibrium point. Today, mining accounts for about 250 to 1 of the reward. That means that on average, a block has 0.1 Bitcoin in total transaction fees across more than 1,000 transactions. A tenth of a Bitcoin. 1,000 transaction fees add up to a tenth of a Bitcoin, and the mining reward is 25 Bitcoin. So 250 times greater reward comes from new coins versus transaction fees. Now, over time, that ratio will change. Now, I'll just fill in the picture at the end. Assume at the end we've got a block with 10,000 transactions, and the mining reward is 1 Satoshi, right? Because that's the minimum reward you can do. The 10,000 transactions each have a transaction fee. All right? Question for the audience. What is the minimum fee you can pay for a transaction fee? 1 Satoshi. There's 10,000 transactions in the block. Some of them are free. What's the average amount of fees? 10,000 Satoshis. 10,000 Satoshis in transaction fees, 1 Satoshi in reward. So the ratio has now flipped to 1 over 10,000 in favor of transaction fees. So draw those two lines on a chart. 251 today, flipping around to 10,000, 1 to 10,000 at the end. And if you think about it, somewhere in the middle, there's an equilibrium point. That's the point at which the reward from mining new coins is half the reward, and the other half is transaction fees, right? There's got to be a crossover point where it's 1 to 1. At that point, mining for reward becomes less important, and mining for fees becomes the prominent driver. By the time you reach 2140, when it's down to a Satoshi, the effect of the reward is so minuscule that already all miners are purely focused on earning transaction fees. So miners continue to mine, and they mine because they get rewarded in transaction fees, not in new coin. And because that transition happens over decades and is in fact entirely predictable, you can plan your investment ahead for the eventuality that the mining reward is halved. You know, theoretically, right now, we're looking at 2016, there's going to be a halving in the reward. So right now, the reward is 25 Bitcoins per block. In 2016, it's going to drop to 12.5 Bitcoins. Here's the beauty of Bitcoin. Last Friday, the Federal Reserve Commission had a meeting to decide how they're going to adjust interest rates. And they write the minutes of that meeting, where depending on whether they are optimistic or highly optimistic, and whether the chairman, when saying the word optimistic, was smiling or frowning, people tried to decide whether the interest rates would be raised in the next month. That's the way the Federal Reserve works. Now, I think people are going to study that in the history books and think, well, that was insane. With Bitcoin, I can tell you exactly how much reward there is going to be in a block in the year 2122. I can do the chart, work the equation, work it out. I know what the monetary supply will be 100 years from now. And what that does is it actually gives you predictability and certainty. So the mining equation, if you think about it from a free market perspective, you've got to assume that the market price, which is the reflection of difficulty hashing power versus kilowatts of electricity, is already incorporating the fact that in 2016 it's going to halve. It's already beginning to reflect that fact. And well before we get to 2016, 6 months before we get to that halving, people are going to start making investment decisions about the hardware they're going to purchase based on the certain knowledge that on a specific day in November of 2016, the reward is going to fall by half. And so you're not going to have the situation where everybody gets up every morning and they're like, 12 and a half? What the hell? When did that happen? You know, they've seen this coming 6 months in advance. So you're going to make decisions like, do I invest in a 4 terahash machine, or do I buy 2 of them? And do I relocate to a geothermal vent to power my hashing equipment or not? So that's the power of predictive market dynamics in that case. I think I'm going to wrap up the questions. All right. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming. I really enjoyed this Q&A session. Thanks for the great questions. I'll be around if anybody wants to ask me some follow-up questions. I'll just have a quick sip of water, and then we can continue and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm absolutely certain that every single one of you enjoyed that just about as much as I did. That was absolutely phenomenal. The original plan was at this point of the evening was to share a couple of things that CoinJar had been working on over the last few months. However, just not quite there yet. So the best I can offer you, unfortunately, is a very strong watch this space. If you're not a member of DNA, I highly, highly recommend signing up for that.
CoinJar.
Thank you, Mikey. Cheers. That's probably it for the evening. We'll wrap up. All I can ask is that once you jump up, grab your chair as well, pull that to the side. That makes our lives a hell of a lot easier. Thank you so much. We'll be live streaming Sydney. If you loved it, you can watch it again tomorrow. See ya.